Okay, in this video we are going to talk about measures of variability. If you're following along in your book, the Pearson book, you're going to open up to pages 378 to 379. You'll want to take out your book as well as your notes. Now, a little background information before we go over what is actually in the book. To understand the measures of variability, you need to understand the following. The first thing you need to understand is variability and what variability means. Variability is a measure of how a data set is spread and what clusters and gaps the data set has. So variability has to do with a measure of how data is spread, if there are any clusters, if there are any gaps in the data set. So you'll need to know what variability is in terms of this lesson. The next thing you'll need to be familiar with is mean. Mean is the mathematical average for a set of numbers. You add, then divide the number of add-ins and round it if needed. So we already kind of understand what the mean is because of our previous lessons, but remember that if you want to find the mean, you first have to add, then divide by the number of add-ins and round if needed. So you'll need to know variability, mean, and median in order to get through the measures of variability. Median is the middle data value of a set. And we've already talked about median being the middle data of a set, but you will need to know that also when we talk about measures of variability. Let's take a look at what the book says about measures of variability. How can variability of data be described with one number? Okay, one number that would explain how data varies. Okay? The center of the data for Anne's math quiz scores can be described using a single number. Okay? So the center can be described using a single number. So the one number would be the median, which would be 88. So 88 would represent her overall scores. And another measure of center would be the mean. So these two numbers represent Anne's overall scores. Okay? Now, what we might want to also know is how do her scores vary from these two numbers? In other words, is she scoring a lot higher than those usually? Is she scoring a lot less? You could, think of it that way. Variability describes the spread and clustering of data in a set. How can a single number describe how much Anne's scores vary from the mean? So in other words, what number could we use to describe how her scores are all a little bit different or vary from her mean? So in order to figure out how her scores vary from her mean, we would go through two steps. Step one, we would find the absolute deviation. And then step two, we would find the mean absolute deviation. Okay? So what we're going to do is take a look at those two steps right now. Let's look at step one. Absolute deviation is the distance between each data value and the mean. Okay? So the scores, the data values, would be her scores. And we want to find out the distance between her scores and her mean, which is 86. So her mean is 86, and then we want to take her other scores, such as 73, and find out what the distance is between each of those values. In other words, you can find the absolute deviation from the mean by computing the absolute value of the difference between these numbers. So in other words, we can take her mean and we can take her scores and we can find a absolute value based on subtraction. So let's take a look at our first example. Our first example, she has a score of 73. So we would take 86, subtract 73, okay, and we're working with absolute value, so we would get an absolute value of 13. In other words, here is her mean. Her score is 73. So if we subtract 86, take away 73, we get an absolute deviation of 13. Now remember, it's an absolute value, so we are talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 units on the number line, and that's the absolute value. Okay? So we can see that her score, 73, has an absolute deviation of 13. That means it's 13 away from the mean. Let's take another example, and let's say she scores a little bit better on her exam. Let's talk about a score of 92. So in this case, you would find a difference between 92 and 86 to get an absolute value of 6. So again, we have the mean. Her score is 92. And if we have 92, take away 86, we get a difference of 6. So the absolute value is 6. Okay? And the absolute deviation then would be considered 6. Now, once we've figured out all of these absolute value deviations, once we've figured out all of those, we can use those to figure out, how much do her scores vary from the mean? So now we would go to step 2. And we will find the mean absolute deviation. Okay, so now we're going to find the mean absolute deviation. The mean of the absolute deviations of a set of data. Okay, so in other words, the mean absolute deviation is nothing more than the mean of what we just found. Okay, the absolute deviations. So we're going to take the absolute deviations, okay, and so if we go back to our table, we're talking about these numbers right here and applying them to finding a mean, okay? So we take our values and we add them up. We find out that we have to divide by 8, so we have 54 divided by 8, and we get 6 75/100. So generally speaking, Anne's quiz scores varied 6 75/100 points from the mean. So generally speaking, if her mean was 86, generally speaking, her scores could go either way about 7 points. Either way. So on a good day, she might be scoring somewhere up around, 93, 92. On a bad day, she might be scoring a little bit less, down 70, 79, 80, round in there. All right? So, now, we can talk about another number that we can determine how her scores vary. How can you describe variability based on median? Okay, so now we want to look at median as the point of varying. Another measure of variability is the interquartile range, or IQR. This is the difference between the third quartile and the first quartile. So the IQR is the difference between the third quartile and the first quartile. Difference meaning subtraction. Since half of the data values lie in this interval, it is easy to see the IQR using a box plot. The dot plot shows Anne's quiz scores for science. The interquartile range is 82 minus 79. So in other words, her first quartile is 79. Her third quartile is 82. Okay? Her third quartile is 82. And what we want to do, if we want to find the interquartile range, what we would do is simply subtract 82, take away 79. So half of Anne's science quiz scores were within an interval of 3 points. Okay? So this represents an interval of 3 points. 1, 2, 3. Okay? Alrighty. Well, hopefully that helped you out. And if you have any further questions, you can see your teacher, or you can review the Pearson Realized materials and videos, as well as see your parents for help.